At the moment the reports reached Allied headquarters, George S. Patton looked finished. The American army had just suffered its first major defeat of the war in North Africa, and the scale of the failure was impossible to ignore. Entire units had collapsed. Command structures had failed. Equipment was abandoned. Soldiers were captured in large numbers. The defeat at Kasserine Pass exposed deep flaws in American leadership, training, and doctrine. And at the center of the disaster stood George Patton, the most controversial general in the U.S. Army. In Washington, voices were already calling for his removal. In London, British commanders quietly questioned whether Patton should ever be trusted again. Even within the American command structure, officers who disliked Patton saw an opportunity. For many, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The aggressive cavalryman who talked too much, swore too often, and alienated allies had finally gone too far. By every traditional standard, Patton should have been relieved of command. But he was. Instead, Dwight D. Eisenhower made a decision that stunned both critics and supporters alike. He kept Patton. Not only that, he protected him. He shielded him from political pressure, redirected blame away from him, and quietly positioned him for a return to command. At a moment when most generals would have sacrificed Patton to preserve their own credibility, Eisenhower did the opposite. That decision would shape the rest of the war. To understand why Eisenhower protected Patton, you first have to understand how close Patton came to losing everything. The Kasserine Pass disaster did not happen overnight. It was the result of months of misplaced confidence. When American forces landed in North Africa in late 1942, they were inexperienced but optimistic. The landings had been largely successful, and resistance from Vichy French forces had been lighter than expected. Many American officers believed that German troops in North Africa were second-rate formations, already weakened by years of fighting. That assumption was wrong. The German Afrika Korps was experienced, disciplined, and commanded by officers who had spent years fighting mobile warfare in Europe. They understood terrain, timing, and combined arms in ways the Americans did not. When German forces attacked through the mountain passes of Tunisia in February 1943, they struck precisely where American command and control was weakest. Units were spread too thin. Communications were poor. Commanders hesitated, contradicted one another, or simply froze. The result was chaos. German armor punched through American lines, rolling up units that had no clear orders and no coordinated response. Entire battalions withdrew without permission. Others fought bravely but were overwhelmed. The defeat was humiliating. Patton was not directly responsible for every failure at Kasserine, but his fingerprints were everywhere. He had shaped the aggressive posture of American forces. He had pushed commanders to advance before they were fully prepared. He had dismissed concerns about German capabilities, and he had failed to impose the discipline and coordination needed to withstand a determined enemy attack. When the dust settled, American losses were staggering. More than 6,000 casualties in a matter of days, equipment losses that could not be hidden, morale shaken across the entire theater. For the first time, the myth of American invincibility was shattered. For Eisenhower, the situation was more dangerous than the battlefield reports suggested. This wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a political crisis. American troops were fighting under British command. The British press was watching closely. So was Washington. Any perception that American generals were incompetent would undermine Allied unity and weaken Eisenhower's authority as supreme commander. Someone had to be held accountable. Patton was the obvious choice. He was visible, he was controversial, and he had enemies. But Eisenhower hesitated. The reason wasn't personal loyalty. Eisenhower was not sentimental about command decisions. He had relieved officers before, and he would do so again. The reason was deeper and far more calculated. Eisenhower understood something that many of his critics did not. The failure at Kasserine was not the result of one man's mistakes. It was the result of an army learning how to fight a modern war. Removing Patton might satisfy political pressure, but it would not fix the underlying problem. Eisenhower also understood Patton in a way few others did. Patton was reckless in speech, but meticulous in preparation. He was aggressive, but not careless. And when he failed, he learned quickly. Eisenhower believed that Patton's greatest value came not from avoiding mistakes, but from correcting them faster than anyone else. That belief would soon be tested. Instead of removing Patton, Eisenhower made a quieter move. He reassigned him. Patton was placed in command of II Corps, the very formation that had collapsed at Kasserine Pass. It was not a reward. It was a trial. Eisenhower gave Patton an impossible task: restore discipline, rebuild morale, and prepare the Corps to fight the same enemy that had just humiliated it. Patton took command with characteristic intensity. Within hours, changes were visible. Soldiers were required to wear proper uniforms at all times. Helmets were mandatory. Salutes were enforced. Units were reorganized. Commanders were replaced without hesitation. Patton moved constantly, visiting units, inspecting positions, demanding answers. Some officers resented the sudden strictness. Others welcomed it. What mattered was that the chaos of Kasserine was replaced by clarity. Patton imposed a simple rule. Every unit would know its mission, its supporting units, and its fallback positions. No more confusion, no more hesitation. Eisenhower watched closely. The first test came sooner than expected. German forces attacked again in March 1943, hoping to exploit what they believed was a permanently weakened American force. This time, they encountered something different. American units held their positions. Artillery was coordinated. Armor responded quickly. Retreats were controlled. The Germans were stopped. It wasn't a dramatic victory. It didn't make headlines, but it mattered. For Eisenhower, this confirmed his instinct. Patton had absorbed the lesson of Kasserine and applied it ruthlessly. The failure had not broken him. It had sharpened him. This was the moment Eisenhower made his real decision. He would keep Patton, not because Patton was flawless, but because he was adaptable. That adaptability would soon be needed on a much larger scale. As planning began for the invasion of Sicily, Eisenhower faced another problem. He needed a commander who could move fast, exploit success, and operate independently when plans inevitably fell apart. The invasion would be complex, multinational, and politically sensitive. It would require cooperation with British forces while maintaining American credibility. There were safer choices than Patton. There were quieter generals. There were men who caused fewer problems. Eisenhower chose Patton anyway. He did so knowing full well that Patton would eventually create controversy. He did so knowing that he would have to manage Patton carefully, protect him at times, restrain him at others. And he did so knowing that if Patton succeeded, he would overshadow everyone around him. That risk was worth it. In Sicily, Patton proved Eisenhower right and wrong at the same time. He exceeded expectations on the battlefield. His rapid advance across the island outpaced British forces and captured key objectives ahead of schedule. His aggressive maneuvering prevented German forces from regrouping and forced their evacuation. But he also caused political damage. His rivalry with Montgomery escalated. His public statements irritated Allied leadership, and his infamous slapping incidents nearly ended his career for good. Once again, Eisenhower faced the same question he had faced after Kasserine. Remove Patton or protect him? Once again, Eisenhower protected him. The reason had not changed. Eisenhower understood that Patton's flaws were inseparable from his strengths. Remove the flaws, and you remove the edge that made him effective. Instead of firing Patton, Eisenhower sidelined him temporarily, preserving his usefulness for later. It was a calculated delay, not a punishment. That calculation paid off in Normandy, in France, and ultimately in the Battle of the Bulge. When German forces launched their surprise offensive in December 1944, Patton was the only American commander who reacted immediately. He turned his army north, moved over 100 miles in brutal winter conditions, and relieved Bastogne in record time. That response did not come from luck. It came from a commander who had been tested, failed, corrected himself, and been allowed to continue. If Eisenhower had removed Patton after Kasserine Pass, that capability would not have existed. Eisenhower never publicly admitted how close Patton came to being dismissed, but his actions made his view clear. War was not won by perfect men. It was won by effective ones. Patton's worst failure taught him how to succeed. And Eisenhower's greatest strength as a commander was recognizing the difference. That is why Patton survived Kasserine Pass. And that is why Eisenhower protected him when almost everyone else wanted him gone.